Emily Reynolds, at 42, was a picture of perfection to the people of Silvercreek. A successful real estate agent, she was always polished, her smile bright and welcoming. She lived in a beautiful home with her husband David, a well-respected construction manager. Their marriage, once the epitome of stability, had grown cold over the years. The passion had long since faded, and though they kept up appearances, the emotional distance between them was palpable. David worked long hours, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts, yearning for the connection she no longer had. Her daughter Grace was the light of her life. At 19, Grace had just started college, and Emily was proud of the young woman she had become. Grace was in love with Ryan Carter, a 20-year-old mechanic who worked hard and treated her with kindness. Ryan was the kind of guy who everyone liked, charming, polite, and with dreams of owning his own auto shop someday. Grace adored him, and they were the perfect young couple in the eyes of the town. But something shifted within Emily. Her once vibrant spirit had begun to wither under the weight of her hollow marriage. She watched from the sidelines as Grace thrived, while she felt more invisible with each passing day. It started as an innocent curiosity. Her daughter's boyfriend, Ryan, seemed to bring a certain energy into their home, one that Emily hadn't felt in years. He was full of life, and he noticed her in a way that David hadn't in a long time. One evening, when David was working late again, Ryan stopped by the house to pick Grace up for a date. Emily answered the door, and their brief conversation felt oddly charged. It was just small talk, but something unspoken lingered between them. She felt it, and she could see in Ryan's eyes that he did too. As time went on, Ryan started coming over more often, sometimes when Grace wasn't even home. He would make excuses, asking for help with something or just swinging by to chat. Emily should have stopped it before it went further, but she didn't. She craved the attention. It had been so long since someone had made her feel seen. It began as harmless conversations, then turned into lingering touches, stolen glances, and eventually a connection that neither of them could deny. It wasn't love, not in the way Emily had once believed love should be, but it was something that filled the empty spaces inside her, and for Ryan it was thrilling. The danger, the excitement of their secret kept him coming back. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of what they were doing started to press down on them both. They knew it was wrong, and yet they couldn't stop. Emily's guilt gnawed at her, but it was nothing compared to the deep pit of fear growing in her stomach. If David found out, it would destroy everything. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of the Reynolds' living room, Emily glanced at Ryan. The flicker of candlelight danced across his face, and she felt a pang of something she hadn't expected: regret. What had started as a thrilling distraction was quickly spiraling into something far more dangerous. They were playing with fire, and deep down, Emily knew it was only a matter of time before they got burned. In the small town of Silvercreek, where everyone knew everyone else's business, secrets never stayed buried for long. And as Emily stared into Ryan's eyes that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that their secret was on the verge of unraveling, and when it did, it would bring down everything they had tried so desperately to hold together. Emily and Ryan's affair continued, but it was no longer thrilling. It was suffocating. The more they tried to keep it hidden, the more reckless their actions became. They met in secret places, exchanged furtive glances in public, and shared hurried phone calls late at night. The pressure of their secret was mounting, and it was starting to show. Ryan had begun to pull away from Grace. He couldn't look her in the eye without feeling the crushing weight of his betrayal. She was everything good and pure in his life, yet he found himself tangled in something far darker. His excuses for avoiding her were wearing thin: late nights at work, helping his uncle with a project, feeling under the weather. Grace, trusting as she was, didn't question him at first, But as the weeks went by, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in her gut that something was wrong. It all came to a head one Saturday afternoon. Grace had been excited to spend the day with Ryan, planning a picnic by the lake, but when she called him, his phone went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, she decided to drive over to his house, thinking maybe he had fallen asleep or forgotten to charge his phone. As she drove through town, her mind wandered to the strange feeling she had been pushing down for weeks. Ryan had changed. He wasn't the same boy she had fallen in love with. He was distant, secretive, and the warmth between them had dimmed. But what worried her most was her mother. Emily had been acting strangely too, nervous, distracted, and quick to snap at the smallest things. Grace didn't want to admit it, but deep down, something was gnawing at her. Her two worlds, the people she loved most, seemed to be drifting apart from her, but closer to each other. When Grace arrived at Ryan's house, his car wasn't in the driveway. She sat in her car for a moment, debating whether to go in or drive away. Maybe she was overthinking everything. Maybe Ryan really was just busy. But before she could make up her mind, her phone buzzed with a text from her mum. "Working late again. Don't wait up for me tonight." Grace frowned. Her mom had been working late more than usual lately. Something wasn't adding up, and the uneasy feeling in her chest deepened. She decided to go home, hoping that a quiet evening in her room might help clear her head. But fate had other plans. As Grace turned onto her street, she noticed something strange. Parked outside her house was Ryan's car. Her heart skipped a beat. Why would Ryan be at her house when she had been calling him all day? And if he was with her mom, what could they possibly be doing? The uneasy feeling in her chest quickly transformed into dread. She parked her car a few houses down, not wanting to be seen. Her mind raced as she quietly approached the front door, careful to make as little noise as possible. As she neared the door, she could hear voices inside, muffled but unmistakable. Her mother's voice, followed by Ryan's. Her stomach churned, and a wave of nausea hit her. This couldn't be happening. Not them. Not together. Grace stood frozen in the doorway, listening as her world began to crumble around her. She didn't need to open the door to know what was happening inside. The laughter, the soft voices, the intimacy of their conversation, it all confirmed her worst fears. Grace turned and ran back to her car, her heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't breathe. The betrayal hit her like a sledgehammer. How could they do this? How could they betray her like this? She drove aimlessly through the streets of Silvercreek, the tears blurring her vision as anger and hurt warred within her. She wanted to scream, to confront them, to make them feel the same pain that was ripping through her. But she couldn't. Not yet. She needed to think. She needed to figure out what to do next. For the rest of the evening, Grace stayed away from home. She ignored Ryan's calls, silenced her phone, and tried to focus on anything but the overwhelming pain she felt. She wanted to believe there was some explanation, some reasonable excuse for what she had overheard, but deep down, she knew the truth. They had betrayed her. The two people she loved most had torn her heart apart, and now she was left with nothing but anger and confusion. When Grace finally returned home late that night, she found the house quiet. Her mother was in her room, and Ryan was gone. But Grace knew that everything had changed. The perfect life she thought she had was shattered, and nothing would ever be the same again. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Grace made a decision. She wouldn't confront them, not yet. First, she needed to gather proof. She needed to make sure that when the time came, there would be no denying what they had done. And when that time came, she would make sure they felt every ounce of pain they had caused her. The days following Grace's discovery were filled with silent rage. She had always been a calm, collected person, but now anger bubbled under the surface, threatening to explode at any moment. She watched Emily and Ryan carefully, observing their every move. They were both completely unaware that she knew their secret, continuing their affair as if their betrayal would never be exposed. Grace, however, was far from idle. She had decided that this wasn't going to end with a quiet confrontation or a few angry words. She wanted them to suffer, to feel the same emotional torment they had put her through. So she devised a plan, one that would make sure their perfect little world came crashing down. One evening, Grace waited until Emily was out of the house for one of her late work meetings, and Ryan was at his workshop. She went into her mother's room and began searching. She knew there had to be something, texts, emails, anything that would confirm what she already knew. It didn't take long before she found what she was looking for. On her mother's phone, hidden under a series of locked folders, were texts between Emily and Ryan. Messages filled with confessions of love, plans for secret meetups, and worse, photos of the two of them together. Grace's hands shook as she read through the messages, her heart breaking all over again. But now, she had the proof she needed. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was real, undeniable, and she would make sure they paid for it. But Grace wasn't going to rush this. She knew that if she confronted them now, it would be explosive. Yes, but it wouldn't be enough. She needed more. She needed a way to expose them publicly, to humiliate them as much as they had humiliated her. So she began to plant the seeds of their downfall. Over the next few weeks, Grace played the role of the dutiful daughter and girlfriend, keeping up appearances while secretly plotting her revenge. She was cold toward Ryan, but he didn't push her for answers, believing she was going through a rough patch. Emily, too, seemed oblivious. Thinking her daughter was just under the stress of college life, Grace kept her anger tightly bottled, waiting for the right moment to unleash it. In the meantime, she began gathering more evidence, recording phone conversations between Ryan and Emily, taking screenshots of their messages, and even following them when they snuck off to their secret meetings. She collected it all, piece by piece, until she had a mountain of proof that no one could refute. But as Grace grew closer to executing her plan, her relationship with both Ryan and Emily became more strained. The tension in the house was unbearable. Ryan could sense that something was off, and he tried to reach out to Grace, but she kept him at arm's length, pretending everything was fine while secretly despising him. Emily, too, felt the distance between her and Grace, but she was too consumed with guilt and her affair with Ryan to push the issue. The breaking point came one evening when Ryan and Grace were alone at her house. Ryan, desperate to fix whatever had gone wrong between them, sat her down and tried to talk. "Grace, please," he said, his voice full of concern. "You've been so distant. I know something's bothering you. Just talk to me." Grace stared at him, her heart pounding with the weight of the secret she carried. She wanted to scream at him, to throw everything she knew in his face, but she kept her composure. "Ryan," she said quietly, her voice cold and emotionless, "do you love me?" Ryan hesitated, the guilt creeping into his eyes. "Of course I do, Grace. You know I do." Grace nodded, her jaw clenched. "Then why have you been sneaking around with my mother?" Ryan's face went pale. His eyes widened in shock, and for a moment he couldn't speak. Grace had never confronted him about it before, and the realization that she knew hit him like a ton of bricks. "Grace, he stammered, but she cut him off. "Don't!" she hissed, standing up and moving away from him. "I've seen everything, the texts, the calls, the pictures. How long did you think you could keep this up? Did you think I was stupid?" Ryan's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked like a trapped animal, desperate to find a way out, but knowing there was none. "I loved you," Grace said, her voice trembling with rage, "and you betrayed me. You destroyed everything we had. For her." Ryan stood up, reaching out to her. "Grace, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." Grace slapped his hand away, her eyes blazing with fury. "You didn't just hurt me, Ryan. You destroyed me." Ryan looked at her, his eyes pleading, but Grace was beyond forgiveness. She had held this in for too long, and now the dam had burst. "You need to leave," Grace said, her voice cold and final. "I never want to see you again." Ryan's face fell, but he knew there was no point in arguing. He had lost her, and there was nothing he could do to fix it. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the house, leaving Grace standing alone, her heart pounding with the weight of everything she had just unleashed. But this was only the beginning. Now that Ryan was out of the picture, Grace turned her attention to her mother. Emily had no idea what was coming, but Grace was about to make sure her perfect life came crashing down as well. The storm was brewing, and soon there would be no escape. The tension in the Reynolds household was suffocating. Grace's confrontation with Ryan had left her shaken, but resolute. She had taken the first step, but the real confrontation, the one she feared and anticipated the most, was still looming. Emily had no idea that her daughter knew everything, but Grace was about to tear down the carefully constructed facade her mother had built. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon when Grace finally decided to set her plan in motion. Emily had been out running errands, and Grace knew that when she returned, it would be the perfect time. She had sent Ryan a final message earlier that day, one simple instruction. "Meet me at the house tonight. We need to talk." Ryan, desperate for any chance to fix things, agreed without hesitation, not knowing that he was walking into the trap Grace had so meticulously laid. That evening, as Emily returned home, the air in the house was thick with unease. Grace sat at the kitchen table waiting. Emily entered smiling weakly, unaware of the storm brewing beneath her daughter's calm exterior. "Hey, sweetie," Emily said, setting down her bags. "How was your day?" Grace didn't respond immediately. She simply stared at her mother, her expression unreadable. After a few moments she spoke, her voice unnervingly calm. "Mom, we need to talk." Emily froze, sensing that something was wrong. She approached the table slowly, her heart beginning to race. "What is it, Grace? You're scaring me." Grace's gaze never wavered. "Sit down." Emily, unsure of what was happening, obeyed, taking a seat across from her daughter. The silence between them was deafening. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them on the table. "Grace, what's going on? You're acting strange." Grace leaned forward, her eyes locking onto her mother's. "I know everything, Mom. I know about you and Ryan." Emily's face drained of color. She blinked, her mouth opening and closing as if she were struggling to form words. "What? What are you talking about?" Grace's voice was steady, unflinching. "Don't lie to me. I've seen the texts, the pictures. I know you've been sleeping with Ryan." Emily's entire body went rigid, and for a moment she seemed incapable of processing what her daughter had just said. Then panic set in. "Grace, Don't!" Grace cut her off, her voice rising with fury. "Don't try to deny it. I've known for weeks. I've watched you sneaking around behind my back, lying to me, lying to Dad, destroying everything." Emily's eyes filled with tears as the weight of her betrayal crashed down on her. "Grace, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for it to happen. I never wanted to hurt you." Grace stood up, her fists clenched at her sides. "You didn't just hurt me, Mom. You've destroyed our family. You've destroyed my relationship with Ryan. And for what? For some stupid affair? How could you do this to me, to Dad?" Emily sobbed, burying her face in her hands. I don't know, Grace. I was lonely, and things with your father weren't good. I made a terrible mistake, and I've regretted it every single day." Grace shook her head, her anger unrelenting. "That's not good enough. You don't get to hide behind excuses. You don't get to pretend that this was just some accident. You chose this. You chose to betray me, to betray Dad. and now you have to face the consequences." Before Emily could respond, there was a knock at the door. Grace's heart pounded in her chest. This is it. She walked to the door, leaving Emily frozen in her chair, and opened it. Ryan stood on the doorstep, his face filled with hope that this meeting might lead to reconciliation. But as soon as he stepped inside and saw Emily sitting at the table, her tear-streaked face filled with shame, he knew something was terribly wrong. "Grace, what's going on?" Ryan asked, his voice trembling. Grace closed the door behind him, her face a mask of cold determination. "We're all going to talk, right here, right now." Ryan's face paled as he realized the trap he had walked into. Emily stood up, her eyes wide with fear. "Grace, no, please." But Grace ignored her. She turned to Ryan, her eyes blazing. "I know about everything, Ryan. I know about you and my mother." Ryan's body went stiff, his eyes darting between Grace and Emily. He had no words, no explanation, no defense. The guilt weighed on him like a boulder. Grace's voice grew quieter, more dangerous. "You destroyed everything, you both did, and now you're going to face the consequences." Emily rushed forward, grabbing Grace's arm, pleading through her tears. "Grace, please don't do this. We made a mistake. We're sorry. Please don't tear us apart." But Grace yanked her arm away, her face twisted with rage. "You tore us apart! You did this! And now everyone is going to know!" With a swift motion, Grace pulled out her phone and began uploading the evidence she had collected, photos, messages, everything. In seconds, it was on social media, shared with the world, for everyone in Silvercreek to see. Ryan gasped, horror-stricken. "Grace, no!" Emily collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Grace, don't do this." But it was too late. The damage was done. The secret they had fought so hard to keep hidden was now out in the open for everyone to see. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, the entire town knew of Emily and Ryan's betrayal. Their once perfect lives were shattered beyond repair. Emily's career was ruined, her reputation in tatters. Ryan, too, found himself ostracized by friends and colleagues, his future uncertain. As for Grace, she walked away from the wreckage she had created, her heart heavy but resolute. In the calm after the storm, Silvercreek would never be the same